Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. Now, after US President Donald Trump's ultimatum, Hamas agreed to release hostages and begin negotiations, but refuses to disarm or cede control. Questions remain over Israel's response if Hamas retains weapons, and whether this risks future escalation. Administrative power sharing is conditional, while oversight is omitted. With the 20-point plan envisioning security measures like buffer zones or international forces, uncertainty lingers. To talk about this, joining us is Saul Sadka, author and geopolitical analyst from Tel Aviv. He has been commenting on the ongoing Hamas-Israel war via his account on the social media such as X, and as well as on other issues related to international politics. Additionally, he is a noted Bible scholar whose intertextual Tanakh edition of the Bible is going into its second edition. His family hails from Calcutta originally. Now, he explains Hamas's willingness to release hostages and enter negotiations, yet their refusal to disarm raises risks of future escalation. Sadka analyzes conditional administrative power sharing in Gaza, absence of oversight, and potential security frameworks like buffer zones or international forces. He also addresses rising anti-Semitic attacks in Manchester, Boulder, Los Angeles, and Washington, and the influence of online hate speech on such violence. Now, thank you very much for joining us, Saul Sadka.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Welcome to Focal Length. We are thrilled to have you with us today. So my first question to you is, now after President Donald Trump's ultimatum, Hamas has expressed their willingness. So is it now ready to enter negotiations to discuss the details? How do you view their statement? Do you think this is a genuine breakthrough or a tactical move?
I suspect this is a tactical move from Hamas, but only because they really have very few options left available. When they began their attack on Israel 2 years ago, tomorrow, they had approximately 35,000 men under arms. They had a huge stockpile of weapons that was nearly unlimited. And at the same time, though, they have had no resupply in 2 years, and they've been fighting a war against a much larger enemy. And there are various signs from the way they're fighting that they're getting low on arms, and they have been for a while. And we know that Israel has killed at least 25,000 of their initial fighting force. And they have captured another approximately 5,000. And we can assume that a large number of them are also seriously injured and taken out of the fight that way. Others have wormed their way out of the battlefield. So what remains of Hamas fighting force is really just a rabble. And it has been that way for a year or so at this point. And whenever the Israeli army over the past year have taken over territory, Hamas have put up very limited resistance, at best what you would call guerrilla fighting, ambushes with limited success. And you can see, even though when you have a war, you expect the attacker to suffer considerably greater losses than the defender because they're attacking. In this case, Israel has been eliminating Hamas fighters at a 50-to-1 or more ratio. Hamas really aren't able to put up much of a resistance at this point. And as a result, when Trump presents them with an ultimatum that allows some of their leaders to remain alive, some of their leaders are going to find that tempting. And some of their leaders are going to want to bring that to pass, and others will object. The question really remains is, what kind of connection is there right now between the Hamas leaders running the negotiations in Egypt, in Qatar, the ones who sit, some of them in Turkey as well, and the ones actually fighting on the ground, who have been fighting, who have been in the thick of battle for 2 years, living and fighting out of tunnels, who have seen at least 80% of their fellow Hamas leaders in the Strip killed, as well as about 80% of their fighters. Are those fighters, are those local Gaza leaders, are they willing to make a deal because they can make any deal they want. Trump and Witkoff and Jared Kushner can sign any deal they want. Netanyahu has already agreed to this deal because the deal is essentially a Hamas capitulation, much to the chagrin of the fans of Hamas in the West, of course, because the fans of Hamas in the West would very much like to have a beneficial deal for Hamas to keep Hamas in power, because they see Hamas as the knife that they have threatening Israel's neck. And once that knife is removed, they no longer have their bad cop in their good cop, bad cop game. So there's many, many balls in play here. And it's quite chaotic. And we will only find out if the deal is successful when it becomes successful. I reckon the odds of the deal coming to pass and Hamas handing over all the living hostages and the 28 bodies they're holding, so 48 in total, are very low. And it could be they simply can't. It could be that the local groups of thugs that are holding individual hostages or hostages in very small groups of 2 or perhaps 3 is how it seems to be happening at the moment. So each of those groups of hostages is being held by concentric circles of isolated Hamas operatives. So the plan of the Israeli army at some point was to try and isolate these groups, to divide Gaza up into small pockets, and then try to come to arrangements with individual Hamas units. That's what it seemed like the plan was. This is different because this is a deal that the entire Hamas leadership has to agree to, and then they have to force these groups to come and hand over the hostages. Whether they will or won't is unknown.
And Saul, now what would Israel do if Hamas delays disarmament down the line? In your assessment, would that trigger re-escalation?
Well, disarmament is the next stage. So currently Israel is occupying the 80% of the Gaza Strip that it has essentially conquered and largely, although not entirely, cleared of danger. So 80% of the Gaza Strip is currently under the control of the Israeli army. In that 80%, there are no Hamas fighters and there are almost no civilians except for a couple of allied groups that Israel has co-opted and are planning to turn into a future clan-based administration of the Gaza Strip, according to reports. And in those areas, there's nothing. There might be bodies buried of the hostages, but in that area, there's nothing. So within the remaining 20% of the Gaza Strip, there are the remaining Hamas fighters, a couple of thousand, maybe 3,000, 4,000. Okay. And the question then becomes, well, what deal can be made with those people? So they're going to hand over the hostages, and then that's the last of their cards. Israel no longer has any need to negotiate with them. They may have guns, but those guns are no longer a threat to Israel. As long as Israel is holding a buffer zone around Gaza, which it will in perpetuity, the guns that Hamas retain are only a threat to the local Gazan civilians, not to Israel. So it really doesn't bother Israel that much. And there are some people in Israel who might say, well, good. The Gazan people are not our problem. Let them deal with Hamas themselves. So the disarmament phase is for a later stage, which we may or may not get to. If the hostages are freed, then the disarmament of Hamas will become the next issue. And of course, without the hostages, they'll be in a much weaker negotiating position, which is why they don't want to give up the hostages, because the hostages are the only thing that the Israelis care about.
Right. And Saul, now factoring in the 20-point plan, what security framework would Israel consider sustainable in Gaza about a year from now, whether a buffer zone or an international force?
So the buffer zone is, I would say, the only non-negotiable. Once the hostages are released, if that happens, the buffer zone is the only non-negotiable for Israel. Nothing else really matters as much as that. As long as Israel controls all the things coming in and out of Gaza to ensure they can never rearm and that any weapons that they have can never be used against Israel in a meaningful way, Israel is not bothered what happens inside. It really makes no difference to it. And on the On the side of the Gazans, of course, it would be wonderful if Gaza could be rebuilt and turned into a peaceful society. But if Hamas are left in control in any way, the rebuilding will never begin. So if Israel, by this deal, is forced or essentially cajoled into not finishing off the last remnants of Hamas, which are the majority of the armed people left in Gaza, then the suffering would be for the Gazans, not for the Israelis. The Israelis can live with a buffer zone protected Gaza Strip in perpetuity.
Right. And so last but not least, to what extent does public discourse, especially anti-Semitic rhetoric online, plays in fueling anti-Jewish hatred that manifests in such terror attacks that we have seen many this year across the globe?
It's a very sad thing to see. And we speak to you from Israel here to India. India is the only place in the world where Jews lived in numbers, where there was never any anti-Semitic issues. My family themselves lived in India for many years and only had peace. But as you also know in India, when jihadis come, they come for the Jews first, as you saw in Bombay a few years ago, when the Taj Mahal palace was attacked, and also a synagogue for no particular reason. When people in the West, who for their own reasons of wanting to stoke revolution in their own countries, use the war between Israel and Gaza, which from Israel's perspective is a completely just war, one of the most just wars you can even imagine, provoked by Hamas, with no intent. There was no intent on the Israeli side to get into a war with Gaza. On the contrary, Israel for years was trying to build up Gaza. It was giving the Gazan people visas to work in Israel to try and help them build up their economy. And they attacked unprovoked. So when you see that, and you see the war in Gaza lied about to try and turn Israel into an international pariah for their own reasons of global revolution, that's what they want to see. They want to see a global intifada. They want to see the world order upturned, and they want to see it done to the Jews first. But we're very lucky that Israel has managed to hold the line over the past 2 years and has defeated not just Hamas in Gaza, who are now gradually coming to the conclusion that the best hope they have is a humiliating capitulation and maybe saving some of their leaders to live in exile. But they've also defeated all the enemies all around them. They've defeated Hezbollah. Syria has fallen. The Houthis are really no great risk to Israel anymore, although they remain a risk to international shipping. And Iran themselves, who set up this entire network to try and destroy Israel, has also been humiliated and will never get nuclear weapons that it wanted to rule the entire region. Iran's plan was to dominate their region, from Bangladesh to India to Pakistan to Afghanistan and all the way across to Egypt with a nuclear umbrella to bring their version of Islam to the world. That was their plan. That has been defeated. We're very lucky. Yet, the Jew hate that has been stoked as a result of this by bad actors in places like Qatar and other countries that have used the war as a wedge to destroy or damage other societies, democracies, to make democracies weaker, has left a stain and a problem that will remain with Jews for a long time yet. What we saw in Manchester, the tragedy, where 2 innocent people on the holiest day of the year were murdered as they prayed. Sweet, kind people who wanted nothing more than to live as Jews in England, as Jews have lived for 300 years. I have no doubt, and I hate to say this, that there will be more of this. And that's all due to the incitement that has happened in the world, where there's no shortage of people that hate Jews. And even despite that, irresponsible actors have been going around lying about Jews and the only Jewish state, and have managed to make in the minds of many extremists, the idea of attacking Jews worldwide a legitimate act of what they call resistance, but is in fact just murder.
Right. We do send our prayers to those affected in all these incidents. And thank you very much, Saul Sadka, for speaking to us on Focal Length all the way from Israel. Thank you very much. And your valuable perspective has greatly enriched this episode. With that, it's a wrap on this episode of The Focal Length. For more international news and updates, stay tuned on NewsX World.